Okay, hi. I'm gonna call this Monster Musings with Miss Mikeson. What do we call that when all of the beginning sounds are the same? That's right, alliteration. Okay, um, so we're gonna get started on Frankenstein because this unit plan is like one of my babies, and I really love teaching it, and I'm bummed that I can't be there to give you guys this lecture in person. So I'm going to give you this optional video lecture. And you have notes on Classroom that has all the stuff you need for the open book or open note quiz. That's the introduction to Frankenstein before we actually get started on it. But in this one, I really nerd out and I give you all the information that's on the quiz so you can just listen to me talk if you want to, um, and drink out of my elephant tea mug, and maybe I'll show you my own little monster birdie. Um, but I'm going to get started. So, we're going to learn about her full name is Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley. Really long name. So she was born in 1797. She has the most fascinating life. I usually don't nerd out over the authors, usually just the books. But this is a different case. And she's like, her life story is really creepy and interesting and super relevant to sort of some contemporary context that we're going through right now. So her mother is named Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was like sort of seen as the earliest quintessential feminism text. And then her father was also a philosopher and a writer named William Godwin. I don't think he's as popular these days. She's mostly just known for writing that. So they were a little bit eccentric. Neither of them believed in marriage, but then they got married when they were about to have Mary as a baby. But then her mom died like 10 days after her birth, or something like that, presumably from some sort of an infection she contracted during childbirth. So she didn't really grow up with a mother or anything, which we can sort of see to influence Frankenstein. So when she was 16, she started dating this guy, Percy Bysshe Shelley, who is super famous romantic poet. And he got kicked out of college for being an atheist. And he was her husband's student, so kind of a weird relationship there. And he was already married when they started dating. But they would go and meet on like the grave of her mother, which is probably where they conceived their first child, which is kind of creepy. But I told you guys this was going to be a little bit interesting and weird. Their first baby was born prematurely, and she died like probably, I think, like 9 days after she was born. And then they had two children together before they married. And this lady that he was married to was named Harriet. So he divorced her and married Mary Shelley to try to gain custody of his children with Harriet, which didn't work. But then Harriet was really depressed and drowned herself. So that happened. Another interesting thing about Percy Shelley. So when he and Mary Shelley got together, her parent basically disowned her. So they just like traveled along with her sister named Claire, which is kind of funny because that's my name and my sister is named Mary. And Percy Shelley sort of slept with both of the sisters, which is awkward. And he really encouraged Mary Shelley not to be monogamous, but she really only loved Percy for the duration of his life, which is kind of romantic, but he didn't really return those monogamous feelings for her. So they would travel, and the summer that she began writing Frankenstein, it was like a really crappy summer. The weather was really garbage. And so they had a ghost story competition. So Percy Shelley, Lord Byron, who is another famous romantic poet, Claire was there, and Mary Shelley, obviously, they were just spending the summer in the Swiss Alps. And so during this time also, galvanism was this like new sort of pseudoscience, and people were studying how to reanimate dead bodies, or if you could use electricity to reanimate corpses, because electricity was really new during this time. So they had this ghost story competition. Percy Shelley and Lord Byron were already kind of established poets at the time. They didn't really take this competition seriously. But Mary Shelley had this dream after having these conversations about reanimating dead bodies. And I'm going to read this quote to you that she later puts in her 1831 introduction to Frankenstein. Okay, ready? I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the Creator of the world. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork, horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, that this thing, which had received such imperfect animation, would subside into dead matter, and he might sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench forever the transient existence of this hideous corpse which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. So that is this dream that Mary Shelley has, and then the next day she begins to write the story that would become Frankenstein. So this story is really inspired by this dream, this idea of the dead coming back to life, and you can imagine she's just lost her baby. I think a year or two before this, her first child. And in her diary, before she started writing Frankenstein, there's this other entry that she writes that we can see clear connections to this idea of the dead coming back to life that she's fixated on. So she writes, "Dream that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold, and that we rubbed it before the fire and it lived. Awake and find no baby. I think about the little thing all day, not in good spirits." So we can really see how this theme of death and longing for what is gone and dead sort of inspires her. So this is the only short story to come out of, or the only story to be published to come out of their ghost story competition. And she was just 18 years old when she began writing this, which is kind of insane because that's how old you guys are. Can you imagine writing this literary, huge monster work, literally? So other interesting things about Mary Shelley, besides sort of living this eccentric life that people really frowned upon, because they were all sleeping with everybody. Percy Shelley died in this like shipwreck really mysteriously when he was pretty young. I don't know how old he was exactly, but then they had this his body eventually washed onto shore, and they had this burial on the beach, and they cremated him, but there was this organ that wouldn't burn, and Mary Shelley was like, it's his heart. But scientifically, it probably wasn't his heart. It was probably more of like his liver or something that had like metals in it. I don't know. I researched it once. So it wouldn't burn. But so she kept this organ of her dead husband, whom she was so in love with. She kept this organ in a jar in her desk for the rest of her life. And when she died, people like dug into her drawers and they're like, "Hey, what's this?" It's her dead husband's heart or liver or whatever it was. So that's another fun fact with Mary Shelley. Okay, so that's Mary Shelley. I'm sure I left something out, but I'm going to talk about Romanticism now and the Enlightenment. So you guys probably learned about this last year when you were juniors with American literature, because America roughly follows the same trajectory of literary movements. Usually it happened in Britain before it happened in America, so America's usually a little bit behind. But Enlightenment was in the... I don't know if I have the dates for it, but it's a question on your quiz. The early 1700s, yeah, 1700 to like 1780 about. And then Romanticism was from the late 1700s to about 1850 in Britain. They're like, it stops at 1837. But the Enlightenment, if you remember, that was the time when a lot of scientists were and the Industrial Revolution was happening and science was being discovered. So people were like, reason, logic, science, like we can solve anything with our human brains if we only put our minds to it. And then Romanticism was sort of a pushback against that. So it focused more on like imagination, intuition, mystery, and more isolation, whereas Enlightenment had been more about like what we can achieve as a civilization. Romanticism was more like we need to listen to our hearts, like our insights. So they're sort of like seem like clear opposites. But the interesting thing is that in Frankenstein, they really sort of work together, because we have this monster being created by this scientist who's kind of a crappy dude, as you guys will see. And he creates this monster, and then it's about the downfalls of that, and at the same time the monster and the man, Victor Frankenstein, is the scientist, even though now we usually know Frankenstein is the monster. Frankenstein's actually the scientist. So we have these like warring ideals of romanticism and mystery, and this human adventure that both the monster and the scientist go on. And then we have the science and the downfalls of science. So it's really sort of criticizing, it doesn't end happily, so it's criticizing both the Enlightenment and the Romanticism, but it's like where they meet. So it's a pretty cool text that way. Let's see. Okay. In your slide, I included some pictures of the Swiss Alps and Mont Blanc. And the Swiss Alps is where a lot of the story takes place, although really it moves around a lot. So Gothic literature is your last... Oh, no, I think I have to talk about frame narratives too. But Gothic literature is an offshoot of Romanticism, began in the late 1700s, more focused on death and horror. So Frankenstein comes out of this tradition of Gothic literature. You guys probably read some Edgar Allan Poe, who's like the quintessential Gothic writer. So some characteristics of this are mystery. The setting is super important. So Gothic architecture is always like described in detail, and you can imagine a dark and stormy night. There's these supernatural elements. Usually we have an anti-hero, which we see in stories more today, like Adam did his presentation on Walter White and what's that show called? Breaking Bad. So that sort of idea of the anti-hero and this like brooding protagonist who has questionable morality is sort of introduced in Gothic literature, with Gothic literature. And then isolation is a big theme, and anti-Catholicism, which was both sort of influenced by these romantics turning against Catholicism with the establishment of the Anglican Church in England, which was Protestant, but also looking back to beliefs prior to Christianity. So looking more at like pagan traditions that would have been in the area of England. Okay, one last thing. Frame narrative. It's a story within a story, sometimes within another story. So, frame narrative in the story, there's like, it is a story within a story within a story. Frankenstein. So we'll talk about it. But often the characters that are actually telling the story, the narrators are unreliable in and of themselves because they are characters with their own like motivations and history, and whatever. So it's sort of emphasizing this idea of mystery and layered truths, so you never really know what's true and what's not. So that's all the information that you guys need for the open note quiz. If I left some details out, it's right there for you in the notes. Not super long. I gave you guys more information. And another thing with Frankenstein, he's in like our movie renditions of him, he's like this big dumb monster. He's like, whoa. But in the actual book, he's super eloquent. He has like the most beautiful quotes, and he goes into all of these musings and reflections on like the nature of death and loss and what is the responsibility of the scientist or the parent or the creator to their creations. So really beautiful quotes from what has been turned into this like big mute monster, sort of, very unfortunately. But I want us for this unit to really be thinking about monsters and what they represent, because people are so obsessed with telling scary stories, and we have these images like Frankenstein that have really persisted throughout history, and come into play when we have like fears as a society of scientific technologies. And so I think thinking about this idea of monster and what monsters represent, especially right now, with this pandemic, is really sort of telling about how we deal with our fears and anxieties, and how those manifest, and how monsters actually sort of help us deal. So thanks for watching this. If you made it to the end, I want to do some more of this. I think I want to read some chapters of Frankenstein. But that's all. Thanks.